Welcome to the Bad Fruit Podcast. I am your host, Jonathan, and today is a very short recap episode of the Denomination series that we've been doing here at the podcast. As you may have noticed, we've sort of slowed down with that. Judah has come back. We've been talking with him about different things, about prophecy, church hurt, and all of that, and we will continue to have those episodes with Judah. However, we are going to get back into the Denomination series, and so we're going to have kind of both of those episodes coming out maybe every other week, maybe two a week, maybe one of each. Not entirely sure yet how that'll all work out, but I wanted to give us a little update, a little recap of where we are and where we're going, kind of a midway point in the Denomination series as we get into the Nazarene Church this week. So I intentionally did not start the series, the Denomination series, in the ancient church with the kind of pre-councils and then the councils, although throughout the series we have talked about the Trinity and the creeds and what it means to be a Nicene Christian and all of that. But I didn't really want to talk about the early church and the church fathers because technically that's sort of pre-denominations. And so really what I wanted to do with the series is start with the Roman Catholic Church, which kind of claims to be the most ancient organization of the church. And then we talked about the Eastern Orthodox. So we did kind of do a church history episode with Krista Petzold and her book on church history. You can go back and listen to that episode. It was a great interview, good conversation. And that kind of maybe acted as a primer for that. And I think eventually on this podcast we will talk about all of those early church things at some point. That's not on the radar at the moment. So what we did is we did talk, just like I said, a little bit briefly here and there about the councils and all of that and sort of pre-Roman Catholic Church forming. But really the Denomination series began with the Roman Catholic Church. And I know that they will argue that they are not a quote-unquote denomination. Same thing with the Eastern Orthodox. But for the sake of simplicity and talking about different things, we're going to call them that. So I apologize, Catholic and Eastern Orthodox friends, for calling you a denomination within this series. So basically, if we want to kind of do a recap today, here's what we have done. We've looked at the great historic communions. So again, that is the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. So for over 1,000 years, the church was largely united as an institution. This era is often called just simply Christendom because there wasn't really denominations or splits. There were some factions. Let's not pretend that they were all united on every single point, but really they were not divided like we are today with a lot of different denominations. And so the little splits were not about some of the things that we would recognize today as denominational splits. So this was an era that was marked by visible authority structures, a sacramental life. We've talked a little bit about this in each episode, and theological continuity. So again, especially the Roman Catholic Church, they believe that it's an apostolic succession, and so there's authority in the popes and within the institution of the church. However, there were tensions and there were disagreements, but there was one visible church in the West and there was one growing in the East. So authority really mattered during this time, traditions matter, and the church understood itself as something that was received, and so it wasn't trying to reinvent itself until the Reformation came. So then in the early 1000 era is when we get the Great Schism, and that's really when the Eastern Church officially splits from the Western Church, and so you have Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, and they become two major versions of Christianity essentially in the world for the next 500 years or so, or close to 500 years. And so then we get to the Reformation, and this was a necessary fracture within Christianity. The Roman Catholic Church, according to Martin Luther and the Reformers, was corrupt and was practicing things that were not biblical, and so there needed to be a reformation. And so we have figures like Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and some other guys, and those guys were not originally trying to start a new group, a new church. They weren't necessarily trying to do a second schism. Instead, they were trying to reform the church. And pre-Reformation, about 100, 200 years ago, there were a few individuals. So we talked about Waldo, Wycliffe, and some of those proto-reformers, and their writings were still being circulated, and so this kind of inspired Luther and Zwingli and some of the other reformers of that era. The Reformation was, again, it wasn't about personality, it wasn't about politics, it was about theology. They believed that the Catholic Church was teaching wrong things. And so the core question of the Reformation was the question of justification. How is a sinner made right before God? And then from that come other really important questions, such as what is the final authority? What are the sacraments actually doing? And what is the church? So from this fracture came the major Protestant families. So Lutheran, Reformed, this is Calvin, right? Anglican, and then the Anabaptists. And here's something important. The early fractures were purely doctrinal. So the Lord's Supper divided Luther and Zwingli. Remember, I talked about the Marlborough Colloquy, where Zwingli really wanted unity, but Zwingli did not believe in the real presence of Christ in the sacrament, whereas Luther kept pointing and saying, is means is. Predestination divided Lutherans and the Reformed or the Calvinists. Reformed Calvinists typically are the same thing there. And then baptism divided the magisterial reformers. So the magisterial reformers were Lutheran, Reformed, and Anglican. And so baptism divided those groups from the Anabaptists. So the Anabaptists were the rebaptizers, and they loosely influenced the Baptist as we know them today later on, but really at the time they believed that they rejected infant baptism. They believed in believer-only baptism, and so they were sometimes called the rebaptizers. And so the Calvinists, the Lutherans, and the Anglicans all practiced infant baptism, carrying over from the Catholic tradition, and the Eastern Orthodox tradition also does that. So this, again, wasn't like just a style difference. It wasn't like, well, we like this kind of music and you guys like that kind of music. It was deeply theological questions that were arising. And so once those flood doors of the Reformation started, where it's like we were questioning how are we actually justified before God, and then it's like, well, okay, so what do we mean about baptism? What do we mean about all of these different questions? And I think it's healthy. I think it was a good thing. I sometimes question later divisions and later reformers, but I think the Protestant Reformation was a really, really good thing, which obviously I am very Protestant. I am Lutheran, and so I'm like the Protestant, right? So the next thing that we kind of talked about was the American shift. And so as Christianity moved into the American context, something began to change. The church became less institutional and more voluntary. There was no state church, no crown, no established ecclesial authority. Religious liberty flourished within the United States, and that meant that denominations could multiply because it was kind of the Wild West, right? It's, well, you believe that, I'm going to start my group that believes this. And so revivalism began to shape what Protestant identity really was. And so we saw this especially with the Baptist streams and the Wesleyan and Methodist traditions. Now, again, we talked about the Lutherans first, and then we talked about the Anglicans. And then it was out of the Anglicans that the Baptists and the Wesleyans actually come out of, two separate things there. And so I'm going to say something here, and you may or may not agree with me, and that's fine, but I think that it is historically defensible. In many ways, Methodism is kind of the last of the historic Protestant families. So under John Wesley, Methodism arose as a renewal movement within Anglicanism. And it was a revivalist movement, yes, but it emphasized sanctification and it focused on historic Christianity as well. It was more Arminian in theology than the Anglican Church was at the time. But really, this is why I say what I said, is it stood firmly inside the historic framework. So it confessed the Trinity, upheld the creeds, baptism, infants still celebrated the Lord's Supper, ordained ministers, and really Methodists considered themselves part of the historic Christian traditions. Methodists still used catechisms, still structured itself confessionally, and still saw itself as inheriting something rather than inventing something new. Now, after Wesley, something drastically shifts. And we're going to be talking about the post-Methodist, where Methodism sort of leads to with the Nazarenes and the holiness movements. But after Methodism, we then get the Baptists. And the Baptists are an odd thing, because in some ways they can be very confessional at times if they hold to the London Baptist Confession. They can be very reformational if they are Reformed Baptist. But really, at the end of the day, Baptists are just a repackaging, if you will. And again, I mean no disrespect to my Baptist friends, but there's an influence from the Anabaptists. Now, they are independent from them, but there is an influence, and they did meet at one point to see if they could work things out, because they agreed about a lot of things together. And the big thing that they agreed on was Zwingli's view of a purely memorial view of communion. So it was just a symbolic thing, and that baptism was something that you do, and it was purely symbolic, and you had to do it after a profession of faith. Now, the Anabaptists believed in sort of isolating themselves from society, whereas the Baptists, coming out of the Anglican tradition, did not. They were completely fine to engage in the community. And so I do think that Baptists are sort of a middle ground in a lot of ways, and they can at times still be part of the Reformation era and the historic church in some ways. However, because they kind of come more out of that Anabaptist Zwingli memorialist view, and where they teach ordinances versus sacraments, I do believe that they're a little bit more on the modern side of Christianity. Whereas the Methodists, I believe, are sort of the last of the historic traditions. And you will notice this, that they're, in some of their churches, they are very traditionalist, and they can even be high church. So again, after Wesley, there's a shift. There's less confessional stability in Christianity. In the 1800s, we get the Restoration movements. We get revivalism. Now, that was part of Methodism for sure, but later groups took it even farther. And what it ended up happening is we get even more fragmentation. And part of this really is that the further you move into the 1800s, the more Christianity, specifically in America, more than anywhere else, becomes shaped by experience, reaction, and reinvention rather than inherited confession. So what that does not mean is that there are no faithful Christians today, or that there are no Orthodox Christians. Obviously, I believe that there are Baptists who are saved, Assemblies of God, Nazarene, all those different denominations. I believe that they're still Orthodox. They still confess the Trinity. It's just something really changed, and really the center of gravity moved away from what God does for us, for the historic church, for standing on confessions, and became more of performance and experience and feelings based. And at times, maybe that's not a bad thing. However, I think that during the 1800s, a lot of division happened because of that, because it was, I feel this, and I think that we should do this instead of, this is historically how the church believes and functions. And obviously we can have debate over all of those things. So again, the early Reformation fractured unity with the Catholic Church over doctrine. During the 1800s, increasingly the fractures of unity were over experience and restoration claims. So we get the holiness movements, Pentecostalism, restoration traditions, the claim no creed but Christ, or no creed but the Bible, those groups, the Adventist movements. We'll talk about those at some point during this series. And then later, the non-denominational churches and the networks. So the question, it shifted, right? It's not only what is the gospel, but have you experienced it properly? Have you received a second blessing? Have you been baptized in the Spirit? Have you made a decision? As word and sacrament lose centrality in some traditions, experience begins to fill the vacuum. As objective promises weaken, subjective assurance grows louder. And as the catechesis fades, revival intensifies. Again, I'm not trying to mock or debate. I'm talking about where we've been and where we're going, and this is purely a historic observation on my part. Even classical Pentecostal bodies, such as the Assemblies of God, they do affirm the Nicene orthodoxy, and they confess the Trinity, so I'm not calling them heretical, but structurally, their church is very fluid. And so the identity becomes less, we confess this, and it becomes more, we experience this. So if we zoom out just a little bit, the arc of Christendom looks something kind of like this. The ancient church is creedal and sacramental, and the medieval church becomes institutionalized underneath the Roman Catholic papacy. The Reformation comes in to bring doctrinal clarity, and I believe it was a necessary fracture. And then we get some small fractures and different reformations in different places. And again, the Wesleyan tradition comes out of the Anglican tradition and sort of trying to reform that or create some movement within the Anglican Church, right? And so post-Wesleyan America specifically, we get revivalism, restorationism, and denominations begin to multiply. So we move from one visible church to several confessional churches that still claim to be tied to historic Christianity, to a ton of, maybe even thousands of voluntary associations, often with no historic connections. They often reject the historic church because it looks too Catholic to them. And so now in our era, where we are today, many Christians are functionally post-denominational. So we have brands instead of denominations often. We have networks, church plants, megachurches, independent movements that are completely untethered from a denomination or even, and especially from a historic confession. And look around. Even if your church is tied to a denomination, today we typically see the megachurch pastors especially, or the church networks and the brand churches, even if they are tied to a denomination, they're essentially cult of personality. They're run by the person at the top, and it's his way or the highway. It's built around his brand. It's built around what he is doing. And so, like with Hillsong, they were technically part of the Assemblies of God. They were doing music. They became super influential throughout the whole entire world, and then they had to break away. We've seen this with our local megachurch. They're breaking away from denominational restrictions because they're trying to create this brand church, and they have satellite campuses and things like that. And so you see this with a lot of the multi-church campus churches, multi-campus churches, where they're essentially a network for their brand, and they franchise out. And we have this basically a business model for churches today. And that's what we get a lot of. I'm not saying everybody's that way. Obviously, there are some good old-fashioned Southern Baptist churches and Assemblies of God and all of those things. And then we have our historic churches like the Lutheran, Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian. I forgot to mention them earlier. They fall under the Reformed Church. They're pretty they're kind of within that same sort of Reformation era. And so today, what the biggest thing we have is this language shift from what has the church always confessed to what seems biblical to me. And that's a massive shift because historically, at the Reformation, again, they weren't trying to necessarily start something new. And so, yes, they threw out a lot of stuff that the Catholic Church was doing, and yet they also retained some of it because they said, this isn't bad. This is part of the historic church. This has been handed down. And the further we get from the Reformation, the more splits that happen, the more those things are completely abandoned in the name of, well, we need to get back to the Bible and what's biblical to me. And that's not a bad sentiment. Don't get me wrong. But are you abandoning all of Christendom, what has been taught for 2,000 years, because you read something in the Bible and you think that that is more correct than what has historically been confessed? This is why it's extremely dangerous when a church is non-denominational and a pastor starts basically just preaching whatever they want straight from the Bible with no confession, with nothing there to hold them accountable. Because I guarantee you, you're not going to read the Bible and discover something that nobody has ever discovered. You're not going to find a brand new doctrine within the Bible. Because if you do, it's probably heretical or it's your own little pet interpretation of it. Now, that doesn't mean that God doesn't speak to us as we read the Bible. Absolutely, he does. And he will bring passages alive to you and show you things. And maybe it hits in a new way when you read it. But you are not going to get new revelation that no one has ever gotten before. So where are we going? Where are we at? So this series has never been about just dunking on other Christians and talking about how much I disagree with them. In fact, I have tried to be as charitable as possible with every single group that we've talked about. When we talked about the Catholics, I'm not Catholic. I disagree with them on a lot of things. Same thing with the Eastern Orthodox. And yet I presented them, hopefully, in a charitable and accurate way to what they actually believe. Because my goal here with this series was for my own benefit to really look and understand what each denomination and each group of Christians actually believe and see if there was any connections, if there were arcs, if there was a narrative that forms, if there was more connection than not, more things that hold us together than don't. And so my goal has been to present things accurately, fairly, and charitably. Now, along the way, you probably have noticed that I do voice my opinion because I'm not going to shy away from the fact that I do believe things, and at times there are some major issues, and I want to at least bring that up. But again, I try to do it in a way that is charitable to the group. And usually I do those in like the Fruit Bite episodes and not necessarily in the actual episode. So with each group that we've looked at, I've talked about sort of their history, where they came from, what the story was about their formation, and we've looked at key figures, what their theology is, what their texts are, like if they have a confession or just books that they read, just anything that is tied to that. And then we've looked at kind of the global stats, divisions within each group. And so, again, I just want to present each denomination as fairly as possible and give you, the listener, an opportunity to go along this journey with me and hear about these different groups of Christianity. And maybe this has been helpful for you to figure out what it is you believe. So if you're struggling with what denomination or what your actual beliefs are, as you're listening, you might say, oh, I actually agree a lot with that. And that might be helpful to you. So, you drive down the street and you see a bunch of different churches, and it's Baptist, Methodist, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Catholic, and it can be kind of overwhelming. And you're like, what is the difference here? Are there any differences? Does it really matter? I say it does. But at the same time, I want you to go to the church that confesses what you believe. I want you to have a good, healthy church. And so hopefully this will help you get some clarity on what the different denominations believe. And it's been really helpful to me to appreciate the different denominations a lot more than I already did. So where are we going? So this week we are going to step into the holiness tradition. So we're going to talk about the Nazarenes, about entire sanctification, the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And from there, over the next few episodes within this denomination series, kind of as we, like I said, we're about halfway through it, and so this kind of rounds us all out. So after the Nazarenes and the holiness traditions this week, we're going to get into Pentecostalism. We're going to talk about revivalism and altar calls. We're going to talk about the non-denominational, aka Baptist culture. We'll talk about the Calvary Chapel churches, the emerging networks like the church networks and the branding aspects. We're going to talk about restorationism. So we're actually going to kind of come back to the 1800s as we've so we're not doing this completely chronologically, because as we get into like Calvary Chapel and the Baptist non-denominational stuff, that'll bring us into the 1900s. And so we'll go back to the 1800s after that, and we're going to talk about restorationism, and this is where we get a lot of the bad theology. We're going to talk about the Adventism groups like Seventh-day Adventists and the Messianic movements, and that's really interesting. The Hebrew roots, the sacred name theology kind of inspired that, and that kind of comes from the 1800s as well. And then we are going to spend a little bit of time on the non-Trinitarian groups. So this, again, we'll go back to the 1800s. These kind of come out of the Restoration movements, and this is your Mormons, your Christadelphians, your Jehovah's Witnesses. So these are groups that historically Christians would call heretical. And those will be interesting episodes, I promise. And then we're going to kind of end where we began, with sort of a 10,000-foot view of everything that we've talked about. And so, again, just along the way, we're going to talk about, we're also going to talk about the global independent churches, because along the way, too, I've made this statement that Christianity is growing in the African continent and in Asia and in South America. So the global shift of Christianity, and I'm not talking about like weird stuff going on. I'm talking about like actual good conservative historic theological traditions are spreading in the southern hemispheres. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as we kind of wrap everything up here. So that is where we're heading, and I will try to walk through these as carefully as possible with as much clarity and charitableness that I can offer, because I do believe that truth matters. And again, I want to be charitable to all these different groups. However, like I said in this episode, I do sort of feel like the Methodist tradition, maybe the Baptists right after, are really the last of the Reformation and the churches that are tied to historic Christianity. And all the denominations that we'll be talking about from here on out really come from splits from what we've already talked about. And it's really almost all of them are about experiences rather than confession. And so I disagree with that interpretation of being a Christian and functioning as a Christian. However, I do believe that they are still orthodox, at least if they confess orthodox views, even if they don't recite the creed. If their doctrine somehow is connected to it, then it's still orthodox. So regardless of the denomination we are talking about, if you confess Christ as Lord, if you have repented and you are baptized and you are part of a healthy church, that is great. Christ is head over the church. And so praise God for that. And I hope that you have enjoyed the denomination series so far. Again, we're about halfway through it. And I hope that you'll enjoy the next half of this as we get into the more experiential side of Christianity. God bless. We'll talk to you next time.